from the backgrounds. So my name is Rachel Sample. I'm the Community Services Grants Manager for IHCDA. My team oversees Continuum of Care, Emergency Solutions Grant, Housing Opportunity for Persons with AIDS, and TANF funding. We are here to share with you some information about the Continuum of Care program and the process of renewing your Continuum of Care grant. We are hosting our first of 3 sessions today. The session is recorded, so if you have any self-consciousness about being on screen, fortunately I'm sharing my screen so you won't be the center of attention, but you're welcome to go off camera if you feel more comfortable. I do appreciate getting to see people's faces, but I know sometimes we need a little bit of privacy too. So just a reminder for that. The links for this will become available after the presentation. So if you have a colleague or a supervisor who couldn't attend today and you'd like to share that information with them, we'll definitely make it available. We'll make all of these presentations available as they are presented and alongside the recordings of the materials as well. Let's hop right into it. So for those of you who are not familiar with the sessions that we like to host, this is my 2nd year hosting these sessions. And what I'm hoping we can really do today is just provide an overview of the Continuum of Care program at a high level as it relates to your funding opportunity to renew your grant. We have staff turnover in these programs. You maybe are a new promoted person within your agency, or maybe it's just been a year since you've thought about any of this and it's time to start thinking about it again. So I appreciate if you've attended this session in the past and some of this may be a refresher for you. I have kind of reworked some of the material as I have had the opportunity to present this information more and more. So if as we are going through, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We will go through the chat and then we will try and have time for questions at the end as well, so that we can address any immediate concerns. And so that in future sessions, if we don't have time to get to everything today, I can build that into what we talk about the next week and the week after. Our topics today are going to be primarily focused around the process of the COC funding. What role does COC funding play in our statewide response to homelessness? What exactly is your role as a renewing project in the Continuum of Care funding process? And what is the role of IHCDA and the COC board in the funding process? Because this really is a group effort to obtain and retain this funding every year. For those of you who are not very familiar with Continuum of Care program funds, the big thing to know about COC, which is very different than many of other HUD's programs, is that this is competitive funding. And the funding process that HUD has designed to allocate Continuum of Care funds across the country is really meant to encourage systemic response to address homelessness. So as we go through some of the things that we observe about how COC funding is assessed by HUD, how states like Indiana are evaluated in whether or not they should get more or less funding, I kind of want to just position this as not only is this competitive funding, which is maybe different than some other funds you receive, but it's competitive and it comes with some carrots and sticks that encourage us as a state to do certain activities that align with HUD's priorities, or to deprioritize things that HUD is no longer prioritizing. So it's kind of important to have that context, especially as we talk about why we engage in certain activities in preparation for the competition and why you may see the COC board engage in certain activities or priorities around year-round. So what is the Continuum of Care NOFO? The Continuum of Care NOFO stands for COC, Notice of Funding Opportunity. Those of you who've been around a long time know that it used to be called an application and then they started calling it an opportunity. I don't know what subliminal message they're trying to deliver to us there, but it changed about 4 years ago now, 5 years ago. Gosh, the pandemic, man, what time flies. But I think it was about 2019, they started calling it a NOFO instead of a NOFA. But it's been a notice of funding opportunity now for a while, and it hasn't really changed in how the competition works all that much in quite a while. It is annual. There are some rumors that HUD team has proposed to Congress that it become biannual, so it would be every other year. So write your congressperson, do what you can, advocate for a biannual competition, because I think all of us would love to not do this every year, especially those of you who receive direct HUD funding. So it's currently up for consideration that this might actually change so that we'd be moving to a biannual competition. It is focused around permanent housing. So if you are ever speak to somebody who is not familiar with COC funding and they're interested in federal grants, make sure that you place that front of mind for folks, because the primary reason why COC program exists is to fund permanent housing. It is our largest funding source for homeless response in Indiana. So we receive now just over $22 million, just under $22.5 million. And that amount has steadily increased over time. And the largest majority of that funding goes towards permanent housing and to support folks who are literally homeless. So again, if you're new, the definition of homelessness by HUD includes folks who are living in abandoned buildings, living in shelter, transitional housing, who are fleeing domestic violence. So this is not funding that is open or available to programs that serve folks who are still in their apartment and needing homeless prevention dollars, at least not at this time. Other things to know about the COC NOFO is that it's actually submitted by IHCDA on behalf of the balance of state. We serve at IHCDA as the collaborative applicant. And we submit the information every year on behalf of not only all the individual project applications, but a larger collaborative application that we work on as a team and submit in partnership with the COC board. The COC is evaluated in our application on things like system performance measures. If you're not familiar with HUD system performance measures, take a quick Google, and I think you'll learn a lot about what HUD prioritizes as far as wanting to see, again, a systemic response to homelessness. And it's really important every year that we are partnering inside the COC network and with the COC board to evaluate those measures as we prepare for the competition. So we kind of know what to expect as far as how well we might perform on those performance measures. It's also why when you go to apply for your renewal application, we ask you performance-based questions. There's expectations from HUD that we do that, but we target those performance questions to align with system performance measures because of HUD's prioritization of those performance measures. We are required by HUD to be transparent in our processes for conducting a competitive application. We have specific requirements that we have to follow during the competition. If you've ever read the notice of funding opportunity or want to Google and go back in time and read a past notice of funding opportunity to learn more about what the full competition process looks like, you're welcome to do that. But there are some steps we have to take along the way, things we need to document, which is why we have partners like Howard and a full team here working on this application to help us make sure we align with those HUD expectations and host that compliant application. We submit our application only after the Continuum of Care board approves our list of projects and their prioritization. And then HUD is actually who selects those listed projects. So last year we had 1 through 78, and we had projects selected all the way from 1 all the way through down into the low 70s, I think. So we had some projects that weren't selected. Typically, this is because they're new projects. The COC board has prioritized funds that are coming from renewal projects over new projects, but that's always a decision that the board can make. And as a part of the board's decision to prioritize projects in a rank order, we have policies and procedures around how those decisions are made, which we'll talk about in a later presentation. So just as a clarifying point, in case you're, again, not familiar with COC funds and what the grants pay for, we have funding that pays for coordinated entry in homeless management information system funds that is a part of the competitive application. We apply for joint TH to RRH, and we have applied for legacy transitional housing projects in the past. We apply for rapid rehousing and supportive housing. So there isn't really another program model that fits into the annual COC competition. If you know anybody who's received youth homelessness demonstration program funds, which IHCDA continues to apply for, and hopefully one day we're granted that opportunity, there are some new program models that are being funded through the COC process, but until you have that YHDP initial funding, it's really these options here for the grants that are funded through the competition. And there isn't typically anything new that pops up. In the annual competition, we also see domestic violence bonus funding, but the bonus funds still only fund within these types of programs and typically have only allowed for coordinated entry, joint TH to RRH and RRH programs. I wanted to share with you our annual COC award growth over time and our utilization. So you will see that since 2016-17, we have seen a pretty exciting increase in funding. There's a number of factors at play here. We had some COC mergers with Lake County, with South Bend that happened over time, where these independent continuums of care merged with the balance of state, so that essentially our application power increased. Because one of the things to know about COC funding is the more funding you have, the easier it is to get more funding, which may be counterintuitive to what you may imagine, but it's important to increase our annual renewal amount so that we continue to have increased opportunity for more funds. You'll also see there those rural grants that we had awarded to us. We applied for them in 2022. We were awarded them in early spring 2023. Those are with the Lafayette Transitional Housing Corporation, Porter Stark Services, and Human Services, Inc. So they are 3-year grants that we started implementation in late last year, and they are this time are non-renewable. So they are kind of a unique opportunity that HUD presented, and we're very pleased that we were able to obtain that funding. So what was our utilization like in our most recent year? Utilization is extremely important in the COC program because it is an annual grant. And when funding is not utilized, it returns back to HUD. It doesn't get reallocated or distributed to another partner. There's no opportunity for us to use those funds once that program year ends. So I'm really pleased to say that it seems like we're kind of getting on the other end of some of the challenges that we saw during the pandemic and our utilization. And we had a really tremendous increase in our utilization in this last year. We moved from the low 83% utilization across the board to just above 88% utilization across the board. And that's really due to the efforts of you and your staff teams, making sure your unit stayed full, working with your landlord partners to move people in quickly, to spend those service dollars on case management and other supportive services. So thank you for all the work you put into causing this increase. This is not something anyone in our office does. You all do it on the ground. And while we work hard to spend the funds that are allocated to IHCDA and the planning grant and in coordinated entry and HMIS, it's just really great to see this increase across the board and to hope and strive for continued increases. Utilizing, just over 17 million of the 19 million we had in this fiscal year 2021 is awesome. But that still leaves like $2 million on the table. And what would any of us want? We'd all love to have $2 million. So just kind of always remembering that even though we have this great utilization increase, we still, can always be seeking for continuous improvement. So for those of you who are not super familiar with our COC portfolio of projects, where does this money go? What's it made up of? The primary funded program model in the COC program is supportive housing in the balance of state. You'll see that makes up, definitely over half of our portfolio, more like 2/3. And that is rightfully so. Supportive housing is something that we support through the Supportive Housing Institute, is something that takes a lot of investment of resources to serve these highly vulnerable people. So we see that as our largest investment in the balance of state. We continue to see growth in our fair market rents this year. So we did see, growth across the board, which did, create some increases in rapid rehousing for us. And as we have applied for expansions over time to see more HMIS and more coordinated entry funding, we've also seen those grow. But it's been primarily a supportive housing portfolio. So just some basic things to know as we get started in the competition. First, if you're not familiar with the Code of Federal Regulations 24 Part 578, bookmark that. I know not everybody likes to read federal regulations, but that is the federal regulation that governs the Continuum of Care program funding. It has a very base outline of how the competition should work. and what the expectations are for the processes of applying for funding, very baseline, that's what that annual notice does. So our annual notice really is the design of each competition. And while HUD relies on some pretty standardized things they ask us to do, they are going to always ask us for a ranking list of projects. They're always going to ask us for a collaborative application. They can throw some fun things in there like healthcare leverage, or this year we want you all to respond to domestic violence bonus funding opportunities. So we do see some changes slightly year over year, and some things that we know HUD is prioritizing that they may decide to put in that notice. And that's always our guiding tool for when we go to apply each year. So funding is competitive. I try not to belabor this too much, but it is important to know that just because you received funding last year doesn't mean you're going to receive funding this year for any number of reasons. We will do everything in our power to make sure a renewal project renews. But if there's something that happens where the project doesn't somehow meet threshold to HUD standards, if you were to go in and not touch anything as a renewal project in your application, that could potentially cause problems for you to actually renew. So it's important every year that we treat the competition seriously, that we treat it as a competition, and that not only do we prioritize spending time on the local competition, which is our internal renewal program application we're going to talk about in a little bit, but also that just to know nationally, HUD ranks all of the COCs across the country. We are competing against Seattle and Los Angeles and the balance of state of Nebraska for funding. So it is a highly competitive process. And if you are considering a new project as an agency, even though you receive funding already, again, we can never guarantee a new project will be selected. We had 6 this year that were not. So it's important to keep that in mind in your planning and in your preparation. We submit that project priority listing of new and renewal projects. So when I say 1 through 78, the highest ranked project was a renewal project, all the way through our renewals that were in rank order of their score on the renewal program application, and then down into the new projects. And that's how we've traditionally ranked our projects. The board can decide to rank new projects above that. And I can share that the board has already set a policy, which we'll spend more time talking about next week, to protect the homeless management information system projects and the coordinated entry projects, because they don't really have comparable measures. They are ranked essentially at the bottom of our guaranteed funding in what's called tier 1, and so on. So we set policies around this ranking, and if you have any questions about that as we move into this conversation, know we're really going to get into that and dig deep into that next week. I mentioned this before, but we use the COC funding to increase our capacity, and the more funding we get, the more funding we are able to get. So we're always looking for opportunities to increase our funding. We'll always try and apply for every dollar we can in the application. The collaborative application that IHCDA is responsible for primarily writing is a part of what allows projects to be selected. So if our team here at IHCDA left all the questions blank in the collaborative application, we probably would have a problem getting all of our projects renewed, because it is a part of that score, and it's a very big part of the new project application. So if you're applying for a new project, not only are you being evaluated on the quality of your new project, but the score that the whole COC collaborative application receives plays a role in whether or not your project is selected, which is why we do, again, our best to not only apply for every dollar, but really work hard on that application. I mentioned that HUD evaluates us on those system performance measures. In the collaborative application, we also are evaluated on our point in time count and our inventory count, whether or not we have bed coverage in HMIS, which is whether or not beds that are out in the state are also logged in HMIS. So if you have a shelter in your community that is serving folks experiencing homelessness and they're not using HMIS, that counts against our bed coverage. And these are data points we are evaluated on annually, and it helps us either receive more funding or be less competitive and not have that competitive edge to other COCs. Again, timeline wise, we usually see the NOFO released in mid-late summer. We make the joke that it's always on like the day before July 4th or the week of July 4th, because HUD wants to ruin our holidays. But it does seem to kind of fall in that July timeframe, and we usually then receive notice of funding in that first quarter. For those of you who are less familiar, that means our time frame between when we apply to when we get money is pretty lengthy for a grant application. We have some of our grants that don't start until January 1st. So that means that they applied in September of 2022, but they didn't get their money until January of 2024, which is quite a long timeline in a grant program. But that is how COC is designed. It allows for that kind of flexibility in when you start your contract. And that annual competition, while I think they always say they'd like it to be earlier, it seems to kind of fall in that same time frame. I know I've already used some terminology, but I just want to break down a couple of terms and make sure we're being clear about what things mean. So the first thing to know is that we have what's called a grant inventory worksheet. It's typically something that we receive in March or April, sometimes as late as May, and we are required to respond to that. This is our inventory of projects in the portfolio of the COC, and we often will reach out to you when we receive this and ask you to verify that the budget looks right and that the number of units is correct, especially for those of you who contract directly with HUD. We don't get a lot of information about how your project operates without looking at what's in the eSNAPS system or what is in the grant inventory worksheet. So it's really important that we examine that every year, because if it's wrong on the grant inventory worksheet, we also sometimes call this the GIW, then it could be wrong in eSNAPS. And we don't want you to apply for the wrong amount of money when you go to submit your renewal. Reallocation is the process of shifting money in either in whole from a project or in part from a current project to a new project. So I'm going to offer a couple of examples. A couple of years ago, we had a rapid rehousing project that an agency said, you know, we don't want to operate this anymore and we don't want to transfer it to anybody. We're just kind of done. And so we reallocated that project. It was about $211,000. All of that money became available for a new project to receive. We can't, it doesn't really work where we give money in reallocation to an existing project, except in some of our DD projects where we move some money around to ensure high utilization. But generally, reallocation happens during the competition, and it's when a project either voluntarily or because of a board decision has funding removed from it and then made available for new projects to apply for. Reallocation is really, really important. Not only are we evaluated on how much we are reallocating, because to HUD, that's a sign we're being efficient with our funding. It is also a way we fund new projects. This last competition, I truly believe we would not have gotten a new project if we hadn't had the amount of reallocation we had. So for those of you who decided to reallocate some of your money last year, or were asked to reallocate some of your money, please know that that money went to bringing new supportive housing into the state of Indiana. It wasn't all for nothing. We were able to utilize those funds to bring in a new project, which is ultimately, you know, what we all want to see is more housing for people in need. So a consolidation is when two projects of the same type combine into one grant. So for those of you who operate multiple HUD grants or multiple IHCDA grants, we are looking at opportunities anytime we can to reduce the number of grants we have applying to HUD. That's primarily because as it stands right now, our team here and Howard, you know, in order to have this successful application, we are checking 70 applications to make sure they're correct. And if there's an opportunity for us to check 65, I'm all for it, because that just means that we have more time to spend on the collaborative application or more time to spend supporting you all and getting in your materials. So if you do have more than one grant you operate with IHCDA or with HUD, and it makes sense for your organization to consolidate, please consider doing so. There are some administrative efficiencies for some organizations, but we know it's not a benefit to everybody. You don't get any bonus points for consolidating. There's no benefit in the competition. It just ultimately creates less administrative burden, both for us in the competition and hopefully for you on an ongoing basis. An expansion is an application for new funding that adds money to an existing grant. So if you currently operate a $100,000 supportive housing project and you want to add a couple of units and some services to the amount of $50,000, you actually have to apply as a new project. It's really important to apply for that new money because it's considered expanding what you operate. It's not just changing your renewal. You can't increase or change your budget in the competition. That happens all outside of the competition. So it's important to understand that if you are wanting to expand, you need to do that. One term that's not on here that I don't think I realized just yet that it wasn't there is a transfer, or when you want to change types of projects. And if, let's say, you're operating a rapid rehousing project right now and you want to operate a supportive housing project instead, you'd like to change that model, you also have to apply as a new project in that situation. Again, we need it to be a competitive process for every single applicant. So we can't just, make a change on paper and kind of move on. It's important to HUD that we show that everybody was evaluated when they came in with their application, whether they're new, an expansion, or a renewal, or a transition project from one type to another. Our annual renewal program application process is called the IRPA. I feel like whenever I say the IRPA, it sounds like I have indigestion, but that's what we call it here. I didn't pick the name, but that's what they call it. So it is our process at the balance of state for applying for that renewal process. So if you hear the IRPA, that means the internal renewal program application. That is your competitive application to renew your grant. So what is a NOFO? A NOFO is our process for applying for HUD funds. That is kind of what I've explained before as what used to be called the NOFA. It's now called the NOFO. And the DV bonus funding is our competitive funding application for new domestic violence projects. Those of you who receive DV bonus funding now, we continue to call you DV bonus projects. I think that's because that's what we named you in the application, and for whatever reason, the grant names don't change. It's a HUD thing. Changing anything with HUD is always a process, so they just stay the same. But we continue to see HUD prioritize new domestic violence funding through the DV bonus process. We did apply for DV bonus last year for the transitional housing to rapid rehousing grant to expand it. We did not receive that funding. If you were a part of that process, I apologize, I haven't had a chance to reach out to you yet. We got a lot going on over here, but I'm going to be reaching out to all of our partners who are involved in DV work and DV bonus funding to discuss how we might reapproach applying this year. We were really close in comparison to past years. We improved our application score by over 40 points, but we were just outside of that threshold to be funded. So we still have an opportunity to improve and definitely want to look at how we could apply in the future. Ranking is the list of our priority projects. So our #1 ranked project is our highest scoring project. And as we go through ranking, we will see those scores decrease. So if your project last year was in the lower part of the ranking, the tier 2, which is usually a couple $1 million worth of money at the very bottom, that means that your project did not score as high as some other projects. We at the balance of state at this point in time do not have a policy about ranking projects for anything outside of their score, other than saying that new projects are ranked below renewal projects. And that those infrastructure projects, to make sure we have ongoing data capacity support and coordinated entry support, are kept in that protected class of projects in tier 1. The collaborative application is that detailed application to HUD. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that this year because I feel like we use this term a lot and we maybe don't explain it very well. But that detailed application really describes the achievements of the entire state in our homeless system response, and talks a lot about activities that different board committees are operating on, different coordinated entry affinity groups or regional planning councils. All of that work is stuff we talk about in our collaborative application. We'll talk about that a little bit more here in a second. So because I want to be clear about this, it is a little bit like we're doing two things at once when we apply for COC funding. First, we have the individual project or grant work that is happening that we are assisting you guys with to make sure that you are prepared to submit your application for HUD, but also to do that competitive application for renewal projects. So every renewal project has to respond to the internal renewal program application process and be ranked competitively. The only, and I should have mentioned this earlier, but the only time we ever do any other protection for projects is when they are new. So when you don't have enough operating time to incur data on your project, we don't rank you competitively. We rank you essentially at the bottom of the protected class of funding, but that really only applies in some very, very limited circumstances. The same thing is true of a transfer from one project to another, because again, you have a new operator of that project. It's a new project in HMIS and you don't have that data there. So things are typically just ranked by score, given, all things being normal. Everything's ranked by score, renewal projects first, new projects second. The highest scoring projects are those most likely to receive funding. That's across the board. If you have the highest score, you're most likely to receive funding. If you are the highest scoring new project, you're more likely to receive funding than a lower scoring new project. So again, that all kind of lines up still with those new projects in that more competitive area of funding, that less likely to receive funds portion of the application. Everything for you all is submitted on eSnaps. If you are a subrecipient of IHCDA, you know we do that for you. So you do not need to do anything in eSnaps. If you are a direct HUD funded recipient, I'm gonna put the biggest amount of fireworks around this. If you contract directly with HUD, you are responsible for getting all of your information into eSnaps. Our team can't even do it. Like, we have no access to do it for you. So every year we have a situation where someone loses track of time and thinks, oh, I did the renewal application, in Salesforce or on JotForm. Those are the ones we've used most recently. I did that part, I must be done. There's what you have to do for HUD and eSnaps if you contract directly. So please don't forget that. Mark it in your calendar when the competition opens. And we will, of course, release these deadlines for you, and you'll be given reminders that you need to go in and submit those things in eSnaps. But if you contract through IHCDA, we will work with you to make any adjustments we need to or make any updates. But primarily, it's some dates. It's a couple of buttons need to be checked and a couple other things that need to be verified. So it's not a huge, heavy lift. But there are some times where we will come back to you and request that you make some changes, whether you're a renewal with IHCDA or you contract with HUD, because for whatever reason, what is written in the application doesn't make sense. We do have stuff that renews year over year over year, and sometimes it imports weird, or what you wrote 2 years ago, made it through and we didn't catch it, but now it doesn't make sense. So do keep an eye on those requests we make to make those corrections, because we would just hate for a renewal project to not be selected by HUD because somebody wrote a narrative that didn't make sense. To maybe if you wrote your narrative, we're funding local street outreach to find children, like that's not what the grant does. So we want to make sure those narratives are accurate to what the grant can pay for. There are project specific questions in there if you are renewing that, again, sometimes a box gets unchecked or needs to be rechecked about what populations are you serving, or are these your budget line items, and all of that is in there for you to verify, and includes project specific information. The actual renewal project application with the competitive process at the balance of state has a very intentional focus on performance, outcomes, housing first, how you engage individuals with lived experience. It has in the past and will continue to provide some bonus points or incentive points for DEI work, and ensuring that you have equity kind of built into your program model, things like that. So what I want to say specifically about those questions is that we are always evaluating how to improve those for our renewal application and our new project application. We're continuing to kind of refine that. You'll see those in 2 weeks, and I'd love any feedback you have about them. We're also going to be providing some additional technical assistance closer to the application date on how to respond to those questions. A lot of the questions were brand new last year or significantly rewritten, and we know we need to provide more technical assistance to you all in responding to those questions so that you have success in your application. New projects are also evaluated on housing and healthcare partnerships. I wish renewal projects could give us points in that area too with HUD, but as it stands right now, the new projects are the only criteria that HUD evaluates us on, whether or not we're improving those partnerships. So you all are focused on your individual project grants, your project specific questions, whether it is the renewal application that we do to competitively rank projects or what you put into eSnaps. Very focused there. We are here to support you in achieving a successful renewal application as much as we can. In addition to that, the IHCDA is working with the board and several board committees to complete what's called a collaborative application, and it is a separate process. It's its own form inside of eSnaps that we compete every year. We complete that application, and then our application, the big collaborative application, is also ranked with every single other COC. And those highest scoring COCs are more likely to receive funding. So one reason why I want to bring this to everybody's attention is that all of the things we describe in that collaborative application, we are then evaluated on. All the things we're describing are activities happening locally in your cities, collaborative efforts happening in board committees or in coordinated entry committees. And if we are not achieving great outcomes or focusing on the right things according to what HUD is prioritizing, we won't score as well. So if you are somebody who is connected to somebody in our network who serves on our board, or if you serve on a committee yourself or are interested in this work, please, raise up this issue that the work that's happening matters to whether or not we get more money. And it is important for us to prioritize those things per HUD. There's gonna be certain things that are out of our control, but anytime we can, do better on our collaborative application, we want to do that. So I give a couple of highlights on some things that are featured in that collaborative application. But as you'll see, the collaborative application is not about projects. It's about what's happening statewide to serve folks who are experiencing homelessness. So it's really a much different kind of evaluation of what's happening beyond just what you apply for in your program application or your project application. And again, it's another very unique thing that HUD does as a part of the COC competition. So I want to hit on a couple of things. There is a process that we kind of produce annually and engage in annually. And it starts as a part of our internal competition and then flows into our HUD competition. Then we start it all over again. So the first step of our process is to have meetings like this. We engage and answer questions. We provide information and context. And then we get ready to prepare you all to renew your projects. The biggest thing that we need you to do as you prepare is make sure you're paying attention to your emails and start reviewing your data. If you have ever submitted a closeout report for HUD and you know that your APR matters, well, your APR matters in the internal competition. And we're going to spend our last session focused really in getting into that APR and understanding that better. And if we need more time to understand that annual performance report, I want to make sure we offer future sessions so that more of y'all can understand it and kind of connect the dots on why the data in those APRs is important for you as you renew your project. As we kind of move into the spring, we're going to start sending out that information about the grant inventory worksheet, and then we're going to launch that program application process that we do internally inside the balance of state and ask you to complete that and then score. We'll be scoring that. We'll then notify you of your score, and typically that notification of score starts happening in mid to late summer as we prepare then for submitting to the HUD competition side of things. So we often try and get as much as we can done for the renewal process before the actual NOFO drops, because we only have about 60 or 90 days to do everything else. And we want to make sure we give ourselves enough time to meet all of these benchmarks and deadlines. We're going to then ask you after we get your renewal application and HUD has dropped the annual competition notice. As soon as we're able to get into eSNAPs, which sometimes can take 2, maybe 3 weeks, we want you to get in there and make your updates or work with us to make updates to your application if you contract through IHCDA. We'll then take all of the new projects and the renewal projects and create one big ranking. You're notified of that too, so that you can see again where your project ranks, where all the new projects ranked. If you're applying for a new project, I'm not even including information about that process in here, but all of that is ranked together. And then the project is submitted with a ranking in eSNAPs alongside our collaborative application to HUD. So this starts sometime around this time period, right, in the spring, and we typically wrap things up by beginning of October. So it's sort of a marathon and not a sprint. So what are our roles in the application to just keep in mind? First, that we have roles and responsibilities. You are considered a project sponsor or a subrecipient, and your process and expectations are to make sure you're doing your project application processes. Are you checking your data to make sure it has good data quality? Are you evaluating whether or not you have any missing data points and making those corrections? And then making sure you have that good and accurate data to submit in your internal renewal project application, then going through and doing the steps you need to do for the HUD submission, whether it is partnering with us to submit in eSNAPs or whether it is getting into the eSNAP system yourself and submitting those materials. We at IHCDA are the collaborative applicant, and we work really hard to make sure we are in alignment with the requirements so that we don't accidentally lose points because we didn't, hit a deadline or meet a compliance piece. We coordinate the process to ensure you can renew your application or apply as a new applicant. We then coordinate the collaborative application. So we're either writing that directly or partnering with people to write components. And then we submit all of it on behalf of the balance of state. The COC board is the entity that ultimately sets and approves policy related to the competition. Again, we're going to talk about those policies next week, but we have a number of them that are a part of our annual competition. And setting of those policies is something we evaluate every year and we codify every year. They also have to manage a conflict of interest. So it's important to know that no one is involved in the funding making decisions of the Continuum of Care program who receives Continuum of Care funding, serves on the board of an agency who does, is on staff. You know, again, if you're familiar with nonprofit governance, conflict of interest, we manage it at the COC level as well through our board, and those conflicts are declared and managed through the policies that they set for themselves. The board also determines reallocation. So essentially what happens is that we have a set policy about reallocation, and we provide the board several recommendations on how to proceed. And then the board ultimately makes the decision on whether or not to reallocate all or a portion of some projects. Again, either voluntarily because your project offers up some funding, or because a project is not utilizing enough of their funds. And then finally, they are also responsible for that project ranking. So again, while we as staff are organizing that information and working with a committee of the board to finalize it, it is also approved by the board of those members who are non-conflicted. I think I've hit on this enough, so I'm going to pass by this because I want to hit on just a couple of other regulations and requirements. This will obviously be in the larger presentation, and if you have any questions about the collaborative application, don't hesitate to reach out. I've been doing these for about 6 years, so I think I've seen quite a bit, so I'm happy to answer questions. So I want to position, again, the competition in the larger sense of why do we do this and why is it important? I'm going to hit on just a couple of key highlights about the history of COC and the Hearth Act and kind of how funding has changed over time to serve folks experiencing homelessness and permanent housing. So funding within the Continuum of Care program, a version of it existed, in 1994, and it was codified in the Hearth Act in 2009. And that's really where we start to see a reorganization of the funding process, so that HUD wasn't necessarily just going in and saying, oh, shelter plus care program, here's your next round of funding. Or maybe some of your grants, some of you have been around for a while, it could have originated with a completely separate division of the federal government and then became a HUD grant later on. But really what the Hearth Act did was it said, we see all these silos happening in homeless response. We see healthcare trying to approach homelessness. We see the VA. We see HUD. We're all trying to work towards this effort. And the Hearth Act tried to essentially break down these silos of funding, break down these silos in communities, and really encourage, I'm going to say encourage, just a little bit force us to collaborate together. I don't know how many of you have experience with other federal grants, but it's very rare to see a federal program where not only are you competing for money against somebody, but you're also asked to collaborate with them. I think the government's asking us to do that more and more, but it's definitely a very unique situation that all of you are in, that you are, in your community of South Bend or in Richmond or Evansville, and you're being told like, hey, even though you both are applying for this competitive money, you have to meet together and plan and respond to homelessness. It's very unique. And the Continuum of Care program application and the program design itself forces this coordination between our stakeholders. And it created this framework to say, we're going to apply competitively across the country using these program models to respond to homelessness. So as a part of setting these requirements, as a part of creating this framework, what are the things that HUD expects? What does HUD expect of us? First, that HUD expects that when you receive COC funding, you are aligning with the requirements of the program. We are asked as a COC, as a balance of state, to make sure that everybody is following the guidelines. Part of how we do that is through monitoring, especially if you're a direct or especially if you're a subrecipient of IHCDA. But we also do that in the project application process, where we check in with you and we say, are you performing, in alignment with what is expected of a supportive housing program? Are you, doing eligible activities? Or do you have a lot of monitoring findings from HUD that we should be aware of, and evaluating whether or not you're really in alignment with the program every year? We also have to have data collection points. As a part of getting COC money, we have to use HMIS. We have to respond to certain federal reports through the Homeless Management Information System. We need to do a PIT count. So while all of these are good things to do, where it's good for us to evaluate ourselves on how many beds we have, does the inventory of beds reflect the need in our communities? we are asked because of the COC program to do some of this stuff. And in the application itself, we have to respond to questions about these categories of data and reporting. HUD also releases a lot of reporting nationally about how the program and homeless response is doing. HUD releases guidance and expects us to follow that guidance and release out guidance or technical assistance on things, and tries to introduce best practices. So it's not just about doing supportive housing, but is it a housing first supportive housing program? Is it low barrier to entry and maintaining housing? Things like that. And you'll often see HUD release these webinar trainings or old series that you can look up on their website to find out more about best practice and operating programs. So again, it's not just about having this money available to us, but about actively promoting certain types of things and certain types of activities with this money. You know, there have been opportunities in the past couple of years to have specific funding opportunities like the domestic violence bonus money and having that rural project application we had a couple of years ago. So the COC program, you know, when it was all disjointed and not organized, didn't really have a way to do some of this special kinds of funding. Now that it's organized in this collaborative way, it tries to promote collaboration in these special funding opportunities and creates them in order to encourage it. And then finally, you know, the application really encourages or enforces that we do certain things. A couple of months in mid-May, we're going to be doing a HUD equal access rule training, which is a training that we offer annually, primarily because not only is it a great training and we have an awesome trainer in Abby who's going to be back this year, but because we get asked about it in the application and they want to know the date we did it. They want to know how it was presented. So we get asked some pretty specific questions, and it encourages us to do certain things in order to respond and have a good quality application when we reply to HUD's requests. So what do we see typically in the annual application, and what have we seen recently? We have seen HUD really leaning in and continuing to promote housing first. If you have been in this space for a long period of time, you may have seen that there are really attacks happening in housing first from outside of the supportive housing world, from outside of those who serve folks experiencing homelessness, sometimes within, but there is this belief that is starting to trickle back into homeless services or people making policy around homeless services that people should, you know, earn their housing or be sober in order to have housing, you know, all of these things instead of, you know, the housing first principles that really the PSH COC program was founded upon. So I know that they'll continue to promote housing first, and we will continue to find opportunities within the balance of state to promote housing first practices. HUD continues to lean into performance. During the period of the pandemic, we saw in the collaborative application a decrease in the number of points that our COC was evaluated on how we evaluated performance in our competition and year round. And now that we're getting further away from the pandemic, those points are creeping back up again. So, you know, a few years ago in 2021, when we were applying, there was about 40 points in the competition for performance. Now it's 60 points in the competition for performance. So when we go to submit that collaborative application, we have to talk about how we evaluate you all on your performance, which is one of the reasons why we ask performance-based questions in the renewal application. There's more and more questions, rightfully so, about how COCs are addressing equity and trying to address disparity to make sure that certain racial or ethnic groups are not experiencing homelessness at disproportionate rates or being evicted at disproportionate rates. And what are COCs doing about how to solve that problem? Some big systemic questions, right, that are not something we can solve on our own, but are something that we as a COC are being told by HUD through the COC competitive application process that if we're not doing these things, if we're not trying to address these problems, we're not going to score as well on our collaborative application. And then, of course, we're always asked about coordination with other systems. This is even something that we see now in the new project application and eSNAPs. If you apply for a new project, they're going to ask you about how are you partnering with all these systems? Are you partnering with healthcare? Are you getting vouchers for your program? So there continues to be a focus there on that we see not only in our collaborative application, but also what we see in our new project application with HUD and eSNAPs. We try and pass as much of this as we can through to the project application so that we are kind of mirroring what HUD is telling us is important. Again, not only because it's good and important, but because we also are asked about it in the application. Are we doing these things too, or are we, you know, evaluating you on other measures that maybe aren't as high a priority for HUD? So that's the gist of my presentation, but I wanted to hit on just a couple of things that are coming. So what's coming up in the next 2 weeks? I really want to take some time next week to get into our competition policies. What is it? What does the COC ranking policy say about how we decide which projects are at the top and which projects are at the bottom and how we make that decision? Get some information to you about that. Of course, always happy to take your feedback. I always take that feedback back to the committee of the Funding and Resources Committee to take any of that information in and advise, and they can take that into advisement as they make changes. But just really make sure you understand and are aware that there are policies and that they impact your program. How do you prepare for a successful application? So especially as we get into the last week together, I want to make sure you all are aware of how you prepare to apply, in particular, what data points you need to be looking at and what reports you can run in the HMIS system to make sure you feel ready. And then to make sure as much as we can at this point to give you the timeline. When are we going to ask you for stuff? when are you going to be asked for e-snaps? When, there's not a whole lot we can know about some parts of the process, but like I said, we know that usually we start in July and we wrap by early October. So we'll do as much as we can to give you those steps along the way to know what we'll need from you and when. And, obviously, though the timeline may change, at least you'll know, well, I've got my checklist. Where have I done steps 1, 2, and 3? I'm just waiting for step 4, even if, you're not exactly sure what exactly at this time, what day that will happen. And then if there's anything else you want to learn about, if there's anything that you want to dive deeper in from today, or if we want to schedule, future events, or I can even just record things on my own if we can't schedule time together, or you and I can meet separately with my team to talk about things. Howard has been fantastic about making himself available too as our technical assistance provider to dig into any of your particular questions with your program and discuss any concerns you have as you prepare to apply. So I'm gonna go ahead and see if we had any questions in the chat. And I don't see any yet, but I'm still scrolling. Feel free to come off mute and ask a question if you have it. I want to also apologize. I did have 3 cups of coffee today and I'm drinking a Diet Coke. I was a little bit nervous, so if I spoke a million miles an hour, that is why. And good thing is that this is recorded, so you can always go back and look at it later. Myra, that's a great question. You know what? Let's set some time at our last call together to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts across agencies. The other thing I can say we can do on that, Myra, that's such a great question. I will do my best to break out what we saw in last year's renewal applications and see if I can present some trend information about policies, about hiring practices or recruitment practices in your agency, or any policies with clients or activities with clients that folks engaged in. But yes, I think that would be great to have a DEI discussion, and we'll prioritize that for our April 3rd session. Awesome recommendation. Any other questions or ideas? Yeah, no, it's a good recommendation. I just want to just interject, since we have a couple of minutes, you're not responding or saying anything right now, is that if you have somebody on your team with a background in grant writing, yes, there will be a transcript and recording. Absolutely. 100%. There will be a transcript. If you have some folks in your organization with a background in grant writing, and they don't typically participate or help you with your internal renewal program application, because it's renewal and it maybe doesn't feel as I don't want to say high stakes, because this is important and valuable resources for everybody, but maybe it just hasn't been prioritized for that person. I encourage you, especially on some of these bonus questions or on these DEI questions, to engage some of that staff, because a lot of them are responding to these questions from other funding sources. And even just how you describe that work can really lend a lot of context to what and how we describe it. So in addition to Myra's recommendation, we'll definitely dig into that. But one of my general observations that I saw last year was just a variety of approaches and how people addressed that question. And part of what I want to do and what we'll do in addition to kind of talking about DEI is talking about how to respond to those questions so that we can improve your scores in that area. Because we had some people who had really great scores, other people who had lower scores. And I think sometimes it's just about how we write stuff and less about what you're doing in your organization. Any other questions or suggestions? All right, I'm going to stop sharing and turn off the recording, and I wish you all a fabulous afternoon. We'll see you next week. And in the meantime, if you have any questions or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out.